Before the dawn of our world, there were choices, and every choice had a cost. Some gods rose in glory, others fell into endless torment. Tonight, we walk into the shadows of their punishments, moments so powerful that even the heavens trembled. Before anything existed, before the earth, the sky, or even the concept of time, there was only chaos. Not chaos in the way we think of disorder today, but rather a vast, yawning emptiness, a void without form or substance. From this primordial nothingness, the first beings spontaneously emerged, not born, but simply coming into existence as if the universe itself willed them into being. Gaia, the earth, was among the first. She wasn't just a goddess of the earth. She was the earth itself, solid and nurturing, the foundation upon which everything else would be built. Next came Tartarus, the deepest, darkest pit beneath the earth, a prison before there was anyone to imprison. Then Eros appeared, the primordial force of attraction and desire, not the cute cherub with arrows, but rather the fundamental force that would draw all things together in creation. From the void also emerged Erebus, the embodiment of darkness, and Nyx, the night herself. These two came together, and from their union were born Aether, the bright upper air, and Hemera, the day. Already you can see the pattern forming: light from darkness, day from night, order slowly emerging from chaos. But Gaia was ambitious, or perhaps just lonely. Without any partner, she gave birth to Uranus, the starry sky, making him her equal so he could cover her completely. She also created the mountains and Pontus, the primordial sea. And then, in what would become a theme in Greek mythology, Gaia and her son Uranus became lovers, beginning the first dynasty of the gods. Gaia and Uranus had many children together, and their first offspring were the Titans, 12 mighty beings who would rule the cosmos before the Olympians ever existed. There was Oceanos, the great river encircling the world, Coeus and Phoebe, whose names meant intelligence and brightness, Crius, Hyperion, and Thea, Iapetus, the father of mankind's greatest benefactors and tormentors, Thamus, who embodied divine law, Mnemosyne, the personification of memory, Tethys, Oceanus's partner, and finally, the youngest and most cunning, Kronos and his sister Rhea. But Gaia and Uranus also produced children that Uranus found disturbing. The Cyclopes were born, 3 massive beings, each with a single eye in the center of their forehead, Brontes, Styropes, and Arges. They were incredibly strong and would later become master craftsmen. After them came the Hecantochaires, the 100-handed ones, Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges. Each had 50 heads and 100 arms of immense strength. Uranos, disgusted and perhaps fearful of these strange offspring, refused to let them see the light of day. He pushed them back into Gaia's womb, back into the depths of the earth, causing her immense pain. Gaia suffered terribly, her body stretched and aching with the weight of her imprisoned children. Her pain turned to rage, and she conceived a plan for revenge. From within herself, Gaia created a great adamantine sickle, the hardest substance in existence, and called upon her Titan children to help her. She needed someone brave enough to stand against their father. Most of them cowered in fear, but Kronos, the youngest, stepped forward. He hated his father for what he had done to his mother and to his siblings, and he was ambitious enough to want power for himself. Gaia hid Kronos, and when Uranos came that night to lie with Gaia, spreading himself over her as the sky covers the earth, Kronos struck. With the adamantine sickle, he castrated his father in one swift, brutal motion. Uranos' blood fell upon Gaia, and from these drops sprang the Furies, the Erinyes, terrifying goddesses of vengeance with snakes for hair and blood dripping from their eyes. Also born from this blood were the giants and the Meliae, nymphs of the ash trees. But Kronos wasn't finished. He took his father's severed genitals and cast them into the sea. As they floated on the waves, foam began to gather around them, white and pristine. From this foam, the most beautiful of all goddesses emerged, Aphrodite, born from the sea itself, fully formed and radiating desire. She floated first to Cythera, then to Cyprus, where she stepped on the shore and flowers bloomed beneath her feet. Uranus, wounded and humiliated, retreated to the upper sky, far from the earth. But as he withdrew, he cursed Kronos, prophesying that just as Kronos had overthrown his father, so too would Kronos be overthrown by his own children. These words would haunt Kronos for all his days. With Uranus defeated, Kronos became the ruler of the cosmos. He freed his Titan siblings, and together they ushered in what would later be remembered as the Golden Age. Under Kronos' rule, humanity lived peacefully, without labor or suffering. The earth gave forth its bounty freely, and mortals lived like gods, knowing neither old age nor toil. Kronos married his sister, Rhea, and they became the king and queen of the Titans. The other Titans paired off as well, Oceanus with Tethys, Hyperion with Thea, and Chaos with Phoebe. From Hyperion and Thea came Helios, the sun, Selene, the moon, and Eos, the dawn. From Chaos and Phoebe came Leto and Asteria. Iapetus married the Oceanid Clymene, and they had 4 sons who would become legendary: Atlas, Prometheus, Epimetheus, and Menoetius. But Kronos couldn't forget his father's curse. The prophecy ate away at him, turning his mind toward paranoia. When Rhea became pregnant with their first child, Kronos made a terrible decision. He would not be overthrown. He would not suffer his father's fate. And so, when Rhea gave birth to their daughter Hestia, Kronos did the unthinkable. He swallowed the infant whole. Rhea was horrified but she was powerless to stop him. When their second child was born, Demeter, Cronus swallowed her too. Then came Hera, and she suffered the same fate. Then Hades, the fourth child, disappeared down his father's throat. Then Poseidon, the fifth. Each time Rhea begged and pleaded, but Cronus was adamant. His children lived inside him, grown but unconscious, trapped in his father's belly where they could never threaten him. When Rhea became pregnant for the sixth time, she knew she couldn't let Cronus take this child too. She went to her mother Gaia and to Uranus, seeking advice. Together they devised a plan. When the child was born, a son named Zeus, Rhea wrapped a large stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to Cronus. In his paranoia and haste, Cronus swallowed the stone without even looking, believing he had consumed another potential usurper. Meanwhile, the real Zeus was spirited away to Crete, hidden in a cave on Mount Ida, or Mount Dicte, depending on who tells the story. There the infant god was raised in secret by the nymph Amalthea, who fed him on the milk of a divine goat. The curates, warrior spirits, danced and clashed their shields around the cave, making noise to drown out the baby's cries so Cronus wouldn't discover the deception. Zeus grew quickly, as gods do, and as he grew strong and wise and full of righteous anger at what his father had done. When Zeus reached maturity, he knew it was time to fulfill the prophecy. With the help of Metis, an Oceanid known for her wisdom and cunning, Zeus prepared a special potion. Disguising himself, he presented this drink to Cronus. The potion was a powerful emetic, and when Cronus drank it, his body rebelled. He began to vomit violently, and out came first the stone he had swallowed last, which would later be set up at Delphi as a monument, then Poseidon, then Hades, then Hera, then Demeter, and finally Hestia, all fully grown and very, very angry. The 6 siblings stood together, and Zeus rallied them for war against the Titans. But they would need help. Zeus journeyed to Tartarus, the deep pit beneath the earth, where the Cyclopes and Hecantochires were still imprisoned. He broke their chains and freed them, and in gratitude, these ancient beings pledged their allegiance to Zeus. The Cyclopes, master craftsmen, immediately set to work forging weapons for the new gods. For Zeus, they created the thunderbolt, a weapon of such devastating power that it could shake the cosmos itself. For Poseidon, they forged a trident that could command the seas and shake the earth. For Hades, they crafted a helmet of invisibility, allowing him to move unseen through the world. The war that followed, known as the Titanomachy, lasted for 10 years. It was a conflict of such magnitude that it shook the very foundations of reality. The Titans made their stronghold on Mount Othrys, while Zeus and his siblings claimed Mount Olympus as their base. Every day, the two sides clashed in battles that tore apart the landscape. Most of the Titans sided with Cronus, but not all. Oceanus remained neutral, unwilling to fight against either side. Prometheus, the clever son of Iapetus, foresaw that Zeus would win and sided with the Olympians, bringing his brother Epimetheus with him. Themis, the Titaness of divine law, also joined Zeus, recognizing the justice in his cause. The battles were apocalyptic. Zeus hurled thunderbolts that scorched the earth and split the sky. Poseidon struck the ground with his trident, causing earthquakes and tsunamis. The 100-handed ones hurled massive boulders, each of their 100 hands launching stone after stone in an endless barrage that the Titans couldn't withstand. The earth groaned under the assault, mountains crumbled, and the seas boiled. Finally, after 10 years of warfare, the Olympians prevailed. The Titans were defeated, and their punishment was severe. Cronus and most of the male Titans were imprisoned in Tartarus, locked behind bronze gates and guarded by the Hecatoncheires. Atlas, who had fought particularly fiercely against Zeus, received a special punishment. He was condemned to hold up the sky on his shoulders for all eternity, standing at the western edge of the world, his arms trembling with the weight of the cosmos. With the Titans defeated, the three sons of Cronus, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, drew lots to divide the cosmos among themselves. Zeus drew the sky and became king of the gods, ruler of Mount Olympus. Poseidon drew the seas, becoming lord of all waters and shaker of the earth. Hades drew the underworld, the realm of the dead, and though it might seem the worst lot, he ruled over the most souls and the vast wealth of metals and gems beneath the earth. The earth itself and Olympus were considered common territory where all three brothers could claim authority. But Gaia, their grandmother, was not pleased. She had helped Zeus overthrow Cronus, but now she saw her Titan children imprisoned in Tartarus, and she felt betrayed. In her anger, she conceived one last set of children, coupling with Tartarus itself. These offspring were the giants, or gigantes, massive beings of incredible strength, many with serpent legs instead of feet, wild-haired and fierce beyond measure. Gaia incited her giant children to war against the Olympians, beginning the Gigantomachy. This war was different from the Titanomachy because there was a prophecy. The giants could not be killed by gods alone. They could only be permanently destroyed if both a god and a mortal worked together to slay them. Zeus, hearing this prophecy, knew he needed a mortal hero. So he fathered one, Heracles, or Hercules in Latin, who would become the greatest of all heroes. When Heracles was grown, the war against the giants began in earnest. The battles were spectacular. Porphyrion, king of the giants, attacked Zeus himself and even attempted to violate Hera. But Zeus struck him down with a thunderbolt while Heracles finished him with an arrow. Alcyones, an immortal giant as long as he remained in his homeland, was dragged out of his native land by Heracles and then slain. Enceladus was buried under Mount Etna by Athena, and his breath became the volcano's fire. Polybotes was pursued across the sea by Poseidon, who broke off part of the island of Kos and threw it at him, creating the island of Nisyros, where the giant was trapped beneath. Each Olympian fought their own battles. Hephaestus, the smith god, threw molten metal at the giants. Apollo and Artemis shot them with arrows. Dionysus struck them with his thyrsus and set his wild beasts upon them. Hecate burned them with her torches. And Heracles was there at every crucial moment, delivering the mortal blow that made the gods' attacks permanent. Finally, the giants were defeated and buried beneath volcanoes and mountains throughout the world, their occasional stirring causing earthquakes. But Gaia, still angry, conceived one final child to challenge Zeus, Typhon. Typhon was the most terrifying monster ever born. He was so massive that his head brushed the stars, and his arms stretched from east to west. Where his fingers should have been were 100 dragon heads. His lower body was made of enormous serpent coils. His eyes flashed fire, and from his mouths came every sound imaginable. Sometimes the voices of gods, sometimes the roar of lions or bulls, sometimes a hissing that made the mountains tremble. When Typhon attacked Olympus, even the gods were afraid. Many of them fled to Egypt, transforming themselves into animals to hide. But Zeus stood his ground. The battle between Zeus and Typhon was cataclysmic. Typhon grabbed Zeus and tore out the sinews from his hands and feet, leaving the king of the gods helpless. The monster hid these sinews in a cave guarded by the dragon Delphine. But Hermes and Pan managed to steal back the sinews and restore Zeus. Recovering his strength, Zeus pursued Typhon across the earth, hurling thunderbolts and mountains at him. The monster threw mountains back, and their battle carved out valleys and reshaped coastlines. Finally, Zeus lifted up Mount Etna itself and buried Typhon beneath it. There the monster remains to this day, his breath the volcano's fire, his movement the cause of eruptions. With Typhon defeated, Zeus's rule was finally secure. The age of the Olympians had truly begun. The 12 Olympians now ruled from their palace on Mount Olympus, above the clouds where mortals couldn't reach. Their home was magnificent, with palaces of gold and halls filled with ambrosial feasts. But each god had their own distinct personality and domain. Zeus, king of the gods, controlled the sky, weather, and lightning. He was the ultimate authority, the protector of guests and suppliants, the upholder of oaths. But he was also notoriously unfaithful to his wife, constantly pursuing nymphs, goddesses, and mortal women, which caused endless conflict. Hera, his wife and sister, was the goddess of marriage and family. She was majestic and proud, but her jealousy was legendary. Unable to punish Zeus directly, she often took her anger out on his lovers and illegitimate children, pursuing them with relentless vengeance. Poseidon, god of the seas, was moody and tempestuous like his domain. He could calm the waves or stir them into devastating storms. He also had power over earthquakes and was called Earthshaker. He carried his trident everywhere and had a palace beneath the Aegean Sea made of coral and gems. Hades, though equally powerful, wasn't counted among the 12 Olympians because he rarely left his underground kingdom. He ruled over the dead, not as an evil figure, but as a stern, just, and inflexible judge. His realm was divided into different regions: the Elysian fields for the blessed, the fields of Asphodel for ordinary souls, and Tartarus for the wicked. Demeter, goddess of agriculture and the harvest, controlled the earth's fertility. She was generally kind and nurturing, but when angered or grieving, she could make the earth barren, causing famine. Hestia, goddess of the hearth and home, was the most modest of the Olympians. She avoided the drama and conflicts of the other gods, preferring quiet dignity to the contentious politics of Olympus. Apollo, son of Zeus and the Titaness Leto, was the god of the sun, prophecy, music, poetry, plague, and healing. He was beautiful and talented, associated with order and civilization. His oracle at Delphi was the most famous in all of Greece, where his priestess, the Pythia, delivered prophecies while in a divine trance. Artemis, Apollo's twin sister, was the goddess of the hunt, wilderness, and the moon. She was a virgin goddess, fiercely independent and protective of young women. She roamed the forests with her band of nymph companions, hunting with her silver bow. Athena sprang fully grown from Zeus's head after he swallowed her mother, Metis. She was the goddess of wisdom, strategy, warfare, and crafts. Unlike Ares, she represented the intellectual and tactical aspects of war rather than its bloodlust. Athens was her special city, named in her honor after she won it in a contest with Poseidon by giving the city its first olive tree. Ares, god of war, was everything Athena was not in battle: violent, brutal, and chaotic. He loved the chaos and bloodshed of warfare for its own sake. Despite being Zeus's son, he wasn't particularly well liked on Olympus, seen as cowardly and troublesome. His affair with Aphrodite was one of the most famous scandals of the gods. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, was born from the sea foam that gathered around Uranus's severed genitals. She was irresistibly beautiful, and her magical girdle made whoever she desired fall instantly in love with her. She was married to Hephaestus, but loved Ares, and she had power over the hearts of both gods and mortals. Hephaestus, god of fire and smithcraft, was the only ugly god among the beautiful Olympians. Some said Hera gave birth to him alone in retaliation for Zeus producing Athena from his head, and then threw him off Olympus because of his appearance. Despite this rough start, he became the gods' master craftsman, creating their palaces, weapons, and magical items in his forge beneath volcanoes. Hermes, son of Zeus and the nymph Maia, was the messenger god, wearing winged sandals that let him fly between the mortal world, Olympus, and even the underworld. He was clever, mischievous, and eloquent, god of travelers, merchants, thieves, and anyone who used cunning to get ahead. These were the major Olympians, but many other deities existed. Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and theater, would eventually join the 12. Hebe was the goddess of youth. Eileithyia presided over childbirth. The Muses inspired arts and sciences. The Fates spun, measured, and cut the thread of every mortal life. And countless nymphs, lesser gods, and spirits populated every river, tree, mountain, and sea. The creation of humanity is told in several versions, but the most complete story involves the Titan Prometheus, whose name means forethought. After the Titanomachy, Zeus assigned Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus the task of creating living beings to populate the earth. Epimetheus, whose name means afterthought, was put in charge of distributing abilities to the animals. He gave strength to some, speed to others, wings to birds, shells to turtles, venom to snakes. He was generous but short-sighted, giving away all the best abilities before he got to humanity. When Prometheus came to check on his brother's work, he found that humans had been created last and left with nothing. No fur for warmth, no claws for defense, no speed for escape. They were vulnerable and weak. Prometheus loved humanity and wanted to give them a fighting chance. He looked at the helpless creatures and decided they needed something special, something that would elevate them above the animals. So he went to Mount Olympus and stole fire from the gods themselves, either from Hephaestus's forge or from the chariot of the sun, depending on the version. He carried the fire down to earth in a hollow fennel stalk and gave it to humanity. This gift of fire changed everything. With fire, humans could cook food, forge tools, warm themselves, light the darkness, and protect themselves from wild beasts. They could create civilization. But Zeus was furious when he discovered the theft. Fire was meant for the gods alone, and by giving it to humans, Prometheus had disrupted the natural order. Zeus's punishment was cruel and eternal. He had Prometheus chained to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains. Every day, an eagle, some say it was actually Ethon, offspring of the monsters Typhon and Echidna, would come and tear out Prometheus's liver. Being immortal, Prometheus couldn't die, and each night his liver would regenerate, only to be torn out again the next day. This torture continued for thousands of years, until Heracles finally freed him as one of his labors. But Zeus wasn't finished punishing humanity for accepting the stolen fire. He commissioned Hephaestus to create something beautiful but dangerous, the first woman. Hephaestus molded her from clay, and each god gave her a gift: beauty from Aphrodite, charm from the Graces, cunning from Hermes, and so on. They named her Pandora, meaning all-gifted. Zeus sent Pandora to Epimetheus as a bride, despite Prometheus warning his brother never to accept gifts from Zeus. Epimetheus, true to his name, didn't think about the consequences and accepted her. Pandora came with a beautiful jar, often mistranslated as a box, which she was told never to open. But curiosity, another gift from the gods, eventually overcame her. When Pandora opened the jar, all the evils of the world flew out: disease, death, envy, hatred, toil, hardship, and countless other afflictions. Horrified, Pandora slammed the lid shut, but it was too late. Only one thing remained trapped inside: hope. Some interpret this to mean that hope stayed to comfort humanity in their suffering, while others suggest that hope too might be a curse, a false expectation that keeps mortals suffering through hardships. And so humanity's golden age ended. Death came to mortals, along with all the struggles and sorrows that would define human existence. But they still had fire, and they still had hope, and they would use both to build their civilizations. As humanity multiplied and spread across the earth, Zeus grew increasingly displeased with them. Humans became wicked and violent. They neglected the gods, broke their oaths, and committed terrible crimes against each other. The Bronze Age of humanity, as it was called, was particularly brutal. Men were constantly at war, showing no hospitality to strangers and no reverence for the divine. Zeus decided that humanity had to be destroyed. He would wipe the earth clean and start over. He planned to hurl thunderbolts down upon the earth, but Poseidon convinced him there was a better way. Together, they would unleash a flood. Poseidon would stir up the seas and rivers, while Zeus would pour down endless rain. The deluge began. Rain fell in torrents that never ceased. The seas rose, and rivers burst their banks. Water covered the valleys, then the foothills, then the mountains themselves. Humanity scrambled to higher and higher ground, but there was nowhere to run. The entire world became an ocean, and nearly every human being drowned. But one man and his wife survived, Deucalion and Pyrrha. Deucalion was the son of Prometheus, and his father had warned him of the coming flood. Following Prometheus's advice, Deucalion built a chest or ark and filled it with provisions. When the flood came, he and his wife Pyrrha climbed inside and floated on the waters for 9 days and 9 nights. Finally, the rain ceased. The ark came to rest on Mount Parnassus, or in some versions, to Mount Othrys, the only peak still above the water. Deucalion and Pyrrha emerged to find themselves utterly alone in a drowned world. Dead bodies and the ruins of civilization floated in the receding waters. They made their way to the shrine of Themis, or in some versions, to the oracle of Delphi, and they prayed, asking what they should do to restore humanity. The oracle gave them a strange instruction. "Depart from the temple with your heads veiled and your garments unbound, and cast behind you the bones of your mother." Pyrrha was horrified, thinking the oracle meant they should dig up and desecrate their mother's grave. But Deucalion understood. Their mother was Gaia, the earth herself, and her bones were the stones that lay all around them. They covered their heads, loosened their clothing as instructed, and began to walk forward, throwing stones over their shoulders. A miracle occurred. The stones that Deucalion threw became men, and the stones that Pyrrha threw became women. These new humans were hardy and tough, fit for the labor and struggles that life required, stony, like the earth from which they came. They would repopulate the world, and from them descended the Greeks of the classical age.
Zeus, despite being king of the gods and husband to Hera, was notorious for his countless love affairs. His appetites were insatiable, and he pursued goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women with equal enthusiasm. To accomplish his seductions, he often transformed himself into different forms, a talent that led to some of the most famous stories in Greek mythology. There was Io, a priestess of Argos and a beautiful mortal woman. Zeus fell in love with her, and to hide the affair from his wife, transformed Io into a white heifer. But Hera was not fooled. She asked Zeus to give her the heifer as a gift, and Zeus, unable to refuse without revealing his deception, had to comply. Hera then set Argos, a giant with 100 eyes, to guard Io. Zeus sent Hermes to free her, and the clever messenger god lulled all 100 eyes to sleep with stories and music, then slew Argos. Hera, in honor of her faithful servant, placed his eyes on the tail of the peacock. But she wasn't done with Io. She sent a gadfly to torment the heifer, driving her mad, forcing her to wander across the world. Finally, in Egypt, Zeus touched her and restored her to human form, and she bore him a son, Epaphus, who would become the ancestor of many heroes. Then there was Europa, a Phoenician princess so beautiful that Zeus became infatuated with her. He transformed himself into a magnificent white bull, gentle and beautiful, with flowers wreathed around his horns. Europa was playing with her companions on the beach when she saw the bull, and, charmed by its docility, climbed onto its back. Immediately Zeus plunged into the sea and swam with her to Crete. There, he revealed his true form and made love to her. Europa bore him 3 sons, Minos, who would become king of Crete and after death a judge in the underworld, Rhadamanthus, another judge of the dead, and Sarpedon. The continent of Europe would be named after her. Leda, the queen of Sparta, caught Zeus's eye as well. This time he transformed himself into a beautiful swan, and in this form seduced her. Some say the swan pretended to be fleeing from an eagle and sought refuge in Leda's arms. That same night, Leda also lay with her husband, King Tyndareus. As a result, she laid 2 eggs. From one hatched Helen, who would later cause the Trojan War, and Polydeuces, Pollux, who were Zeus's children, and thus immortal or semi-divine. From the other egg came Clytemnestra and Castor, who were mortal children of Tyndareus. Danae, a princess of Argos, was locked in a bronze tower by her father Acrisius, who had been told by an oracle that his daughter's son would kill him. But Zeus came to her in the form of a shower of golden rain, falling through the roof and into her lap. She conceived Perseus, who would indeed grow up to become one of the greatest heroes. When Acrisius discovered the baby, he locked both mother and child in a chest and threw them into the sea. But they survived, rescued by a fisherman. The affair with Semele, a mortal princess of Thebes, ended tragically. Zeus came to her as a mortal man, and she became pregnant with his child. Hera, discovering the affair, disguised herself as an old woman and befriended Semele. She planted doubts in the princess's mind, suggesting that her lover might not actually be Zeus. Semele asked Zeus to grant her one wish, and he foolishly swore on the river Styx, an unbreakable oath, to give her anything. She asked him to see him in his true divine form, as he appeared to Hera. Zeus begged her to ask for anything else, knowing what would happen, but bound by his oath, he had to comply. When he appeared in his full glory, surrounded by lightning and thunder, Semele was instantly incinerated by the divine radiance. Zeus snatched their unborn child from her womb and sewed it into his own thigh, carrying it to term. This child was Dionysus, the god of wine, who was thus twice born. Not all of Zeus's loves were non-consensual or deceptive. He genuinely loved some of his paramours, like Leto, the Titaness, who bore him Apollo and Artemis, although Hera's jealousy forced her to wander the earth until she found the floating island of Delos, where she could finally give birth. And there was Minamike, the Titaness of memory, with whom Zeus spent 9 consecutive nights, resulting in the birth of the 9 Muses. But perhaps his most interesting relationship was with Metis, the Oceanid goddess of wisdom and Zeus's first wife. An oracle prophesied that Metis would bear 2 children, first a daughter equal to Zeus in wisdom, then a son who would overthrow him. When Metis became pregnant, Zeus remembered his father's curse and his grandfather's fate. But instead of swallowing his child, he swallowed Metis herself while she was still pregnant. Time passed, and Zeus developed a terrible headache. Finally, he asked Hephaestus to split his skull open with an axe. When he did, Athena sprang out fully grown and armored, ready for battle. Metis remained inside Zeus, however, continuing to advise him with her wisdom from within.
Hera's jealousy was legendary and terrible. Unable to punish Zeus directly for his infidelities, she took her rage out on his lovers and their children. Her vengeance was creative and cruel, and the stories of those who suffered her wrath are among the most tragic in mythology. Callisto was a nymph and follower of Artemis, sworn to virginity. Zeus seduced her, either in his own form or disguised as Artemis herself. When Callisto became pregnant, she tried to hide it, but eventually Artemis discovered the betrayal while the nymphs were bathing. Furious that her follower had broken her vow, Artemis expelled Callisto from her band. Then Hera, discovering Zeus's role, transformed Callisto into a bear. Callisto wandered the forests in animal form for years, unable to speak or make herself understood. When she encountered her son Arcas, now grown, He nearly killed her with his spear, not recognizing his mother. Zeus, taking pity, placed them both in the sky as constellations, Callisto as Ursa Major, the Great Bear, and Arcas as either Ursa Minor or Boötes. But Hera wasn't satisfied even with this. She convinced Oceanus and Tethys never to let the bears bathe in their waters, which is why these constellations never set below the horizon in northern latitudes. Echo, a beautiful nymph known for her voice, made the mistake of distracting Hera with long, entertaining stories while Zeus carried on his affairs. When Hera realized she'd been tricked, she cursed Echo, taking away her ability to speak except to repeat the last words spoken to her. Later, Echo fell desperately in love with the beautiful youth Narcissus, but cursed as she was, she couldn't tell him. She could only repeat his words back to him. Narcissus, who loved only himself, rejected her cruelly. Echo wasted away in her grief until nothing remained but her voice, which still haunts lonely places, repeating the words of others. Lamia was a Libyan queen of extraordinary beauty whom Zeus loved. She bore him several children, but when Hera discovered the affair, she killed all of Lamia's children except one. Driven mad by grief, she became a monster who devoured other women's children. Hera also cursed her so she could never close her eyes, forcing her to see forever the vision of her dead children. Zeus, in pity, gave her the ability to remove her eyes so she could rest, but the curse had already transformed her into something monstrous. But Hera's most sustained persecution was reserved for Heracles, the greatest of all heroes, and Zeus's son by the mortal woman Alcmene. Hera's hatred of Heracles began before he was even born and would follow him throughout his entire life, driving him to madness and forcing him to perform seemingly impossible tasks. Yet, paradoxically, this persecution would forge Heracles into the greatest hero Greece would ever know.
Alcmene was the wife of Amphitryon, and she was known throughout Greece for her beauty and virtue. Zeus desired her, but Alcmene was faithful to her husband. So Zeus waited until Amphitryon was away at war, then disguised himself as Amphitryon and came to Alcmene's bed. He even made the night 3 times as long so he could spend more time with her. When the real Amphitryon returned the next day, Alcmene was confused by his lack of enthusiasm. She thought they'd just been together. From that night, she conceived twins, Heracles, son of Zeus, and Iphicles, son of Amphitryon. Zeus boasted to the other gods that a descendant of Perseus would be born that day, who would rule all those around him. Hera, realizing he meant his son by Alcmene, took action. She rushed to Argos and hastened the birth of Eurystheus, another descendant of Perseus, who was not due for another month. Then she delayed Alcmene's labor. Thus Eurystheus was born first, and by Zeus's own decree, he would be the one to rule over Heracles. When Heracles was 8 months old,
Hera sent 2 enormous serpents to kill him in his cradle. But the infant Heracles grabbed the snakes by their throats and strangled them with his bare hands, laughing as he did so. This was the first sign of his incredible strength. His twin brother, Iphicles, screamed in terror, showing clearly which child was divine and which was mortal. Heracles grew into a young man of enormous size and strength, but his education was mixed. He learned music from Linus, wrestling from Autolycus, archery from Eurytus, and chariot driving from Amphitryon. But his temper was fierce. When Linus struck him during a lesson, Heracles killed him with his own lyre in a fit of rage. Amphitryon, fearing what else might happen, sent Heracles away to tend cattle in the mountains. It was during this time that Heracles faced his first real choice. A beautiful woman named Vice appeared to him, promising a life of pleasure, ease, and self-indulgence. But then Virtue appeared, a noblewoman of great dignity, who promised him a life of hard work and great deeds that would earn him immortal glory. Heracles chose Virtue's path, setting the course for his entire life. As a young man, Heracles killed the lion of Cithaeron, a beast that had been ravaging local flocks. He wore its skin as a cloak ever after. He also freed Thebes from the oppressive tribute it paid to King Erginus of Orchomenus. Creon, king of Thebes, was so grateful that he gave Heracles his daughter Megara as a wife. They had several children together, and for a while Heracles was happy. But Hera was not finished with him. She struck him with a fit of madness, and in his delirium, Heracles mistook his wife and children for enemies. He killed them all with his own hands. When the madness lifted and he saw what he had done, his grief was unbearable. He went to the oracle at Delphi to ask how he could atone for his crime. And the Pythia told him he must serve his cousin Eurystheus, the king of Tiryns, for 12 years and perform whatever labors Eurystheus demanded. Eurystheus was a coward who feared Heracles' strength, and with Hera's guidance, he devised 12 labors that he believed would be impossible, each one designed to kill the hero. The first labor, the Nemean lion, was no ordinary beast. Its hide was impervious to all weapons. Arrows bounced off it, swords shattered against it, spears could not pierce it. It had been terrorizing the region of Nemea, dragging people into its cave and devouring them. Heracles tracked the lion and quickly realized his arrows were useless. So he blocked one entrance to its cave and entered through the other. When the lion attacked him, Heracles wrestled it with his bare hands, finally strangling it to death. He tried to skin it with his knife, but the blade couldn't cut the hide. Finally, Athena appeared and suggested he use the lion's own claws. Heracles skinned it and wore the impenetrable hide as armor from that day forward, with the lion's head serving as a helmet. The second labor, the Lernaean Hydra. The Hydra was a massive water serpent with 9 heads, some say more, that lived in the swamps of Lerna. Its breath was poisonous, and its blood was so toxic that even its scent could kill. Worst of all, whenever Heracles cut off one of its heads, 2 more grew in its place. Heracles realized he needed help and called upon his nephew, Iolaus. Together, they devised a strategy. After Heracles cut off each head, Iolaus would immediately sear the neck stump with a burning torch, preventing new heads from growing. One head was immortal, so Heracles buried it under a massive rock. He then dipped his arrows in the Hydra's poisonous blood, making them deadly weapons that would cause excruciating, incurable wounds. However, Eurystheus declared this labor didn't count, since Heracles had help. The third labor, the Ceryneian hind, this was a sacred deer with golden antlers and bronze hooves, sacred to Artemis. It was incredibly fast, and Eurystheus ordered him to capture it alive, a seemingly impossible task that would also risk offending Artemis. Heracles pursued the hind for an entire year, following it across Greece and into the land of the Hyperboreans. Finally, he managed to catch it while it slept, or, in another version, wounded it slightly with an arrow and captured it. When Artemis confronted him, angry that he'd harmed her sacred animal, Heracles explained he was acting under orders and meant no disrespect. Artemis forgave him and let him take the hind to Eurystheus, provided he released it afterward. The fourth labor, the Erymanthon boar. This massive boar lived on Mount Erymanthus and terrorized the countryside. Heracles had to capture it alive. He chased it through the snow until it was exhausted, then trapped it in deep snowdrifts and brought it back to Eurystheus on his shoulders. The king was so terrified when he saw the boar that he hid in a large bronze jar buried in the ground. During this labor, Heracles also stayed with the centaur Pholus, and tragedy struck when Heracles accidentally killed his friend Chiron, the wise centaur who had taught many heroes. An arrow poisoned with Hydra blood scratched Chiron, and though he was immortal, the pain was so unbearable that he begged to die. Eventually, Chiron gave up his immortality to Prometheus, allowing himself to finally escape the agony. The fifth labor, the Augean stables. King Augeas of Elis had vast herds of cattle, and their stables hadn't been cleaned in 30 years. The filth was mountainous, and the stench was overwhelming. Eurystheus, hoping to humiliate Heracles, ordered him to clean the stables in a single day. Heracles, thinking cleverly rather than relying on strength, made a deal with Augeas. He would clean the stables if Augeas gave him 1/10 of his cattle. Augeas agreed, thinking it impossible. Heracles then diverted 2 rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, through the stables, and the rushing water swept away all the filth in 1 day. When Augeas refused to pay, Heracles later returned and killed him. But Eurystheus declared this labor didn't count because Heracles had demanded payment. The sixth labor, the Stymphalian birds. These were man-eating birds with bronze beaks, metal feathers they could launch like arrows, and toxic droppings. They lived in a swamp near Lake Stymphalia and had driven away all the local inhabitants. Heracles couldn't reach them in the swamp, so Athena gave him a bronze rattle made by Hephaestus. The noise startled the birds into flight, and as they took to the air, Heracles shot them down with his arrows. Those that escaped flew away and never returned. The seventh labor, the Cretan bull. This was a magnificent bull that Poseidon had given to King Minos of Crete. Minos was supposed to sacrifice it, but kept it because of its beauty. As punishment, Poseidon made the bull go mad, and it rampaged across Crete, breathing fire and causing destruction. Heracles had to capture it alive. He wrestled the bull into submission and carried it on his back across the sea to Eurystheus. The king wanted to sacrifice it to Hera, but she refused the offering because it had been captured by Heracles. The bull was released and eventually made its way to Marathon, where it continued to cause trouble until Theseus killed it years later. The eighth labor, the mares of Diomedes. King Diomedes of Thrace owned 4 man-eating mares that he fed with the flesh of his guests. Heracles had to bring them to Eurystheus. He captured the mares and left them in the care of his friend Abderus while he fought Diomedes' men. But the mares were so wild and strong that they killed and ate Abderus. In grief and rage, Heracles fed Diomedes himself to his own mares, which calmed them. He founded the city of Abdera in his friend's honor and brought the tamed mares to Eurystheus, who dedicated them to Hera and set them free. The ninth labor, the belt of Hippolyta. Hippolyta was queen of the Amazons, a tribe of warrior women, and she possessed a magical belt given to her by Ares. Eurystheus' daughter wanted this belt, so he sent Heracles to get it. When Heracles arrived in the Amazon kingdom, Hippolyta was actually impressed by him and agreed to give him the belt. But Hera, disguised as an Amazon, spread a rumor that Heracles was planning to kidnap the queen. The Amazons attacked, and in the confusion, Heracles thought Hippolyta had betrayed him. He killed her and took the belt. In some versions, he also took the Amazon princess Antiope, who became Theseus's wife. The 10th labor, the cattle of Geryon. Geryon was a monster with 3 bodies joined at the waist, and he owned a herd of beautiful red cattle guarded by a 2-headed dog named Orthrus and a herdsman named Eurytion. These cattle lived on the island of Erythea, far to the west, beyond the known world. Just getting there was an adventure. Heracles had to travel through Libya and was so annoyed by the heat that he shot an arrow at the sun. Helios, the sun god, was amused by his boldness and lent Heracles his golden cup to sail across the ocean. Heracles killed Orthrus, Eurytion, and finally Geryon himself, who required 3 fatal wounds, 1 for each body. On the way back, Heracles set up the Pillars of Heracles, the Straits of Gibraltar, to mark the edge of the known world. The journey back was arduous, and the cattle scattered several times, but eventually Heracles delivered them to Eurystheus, who sacrificed them to Hera. The 11th labor, the apples of the Hesperides. The Hesperides were nymphs who guarded a tree that bore golden apples, a wedding gift from Gaia to Hera. The tree was in a garden at the edge of the world, protected by Ladon, a 100-headed dragon. This was perhaps the most difficult labor because Heracles didn't even know where the garden was. He wandered for years, having various adventures. He wrestled the sea god Nereus to force him to reveal the location. He freed Prometheus from his eternal torture, and in gratitude, Prometheus advised him to have Atlas get the apples, since the Hesperides were Atlas's daughters. When Heracles found Atlas, still holding up the sky at the edge of the world, he offered to take the burden temporarily if Atlas would get the apples. Atlas, thrilled at the prospect of freedom, agreed. He retrieved the apples, but when he returned, he said he would deliver them to Eurystheus himself. He didn't want to take back the sky. Heracles pretended to agree, but asked Atlas to hold the sky for just a moment while he put padding on his shoulders. As soon as Atlas took back the weight, Heracles grabbed the apples and left. When the apples were presented to Eurystheus, he gave them back to Heracles, who gave them to Athena, who returned them to the garden, since they were too sacred to remain in mortal hands. The 12th labor, capturing Cerberus. The final and most dangerous labor was to descend into the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that guarded its gates. This meant Heracles had to enter the realm of the dead while still alive, something almost no mortal had ever done. He was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries to prepare him for the journey. Guided by Hermes, Heracles descended into the underworld. In Hades, Heracles encountered many shades and spirits. He freed Theseus, who had been trapped there for trying to kidnap Persephone, though he couldn't free Theseus's companion, Pirithous, who had to remain as punishment. When Heracles asked Hades for permission to take Cerberus, the god of the dead agreed on one condition. Heracles had to subdue the beast without using weapons. Heracles wrestled Cerberus into submission with his bare hands, despite the dog's 3 sets of jaws and the serpent for a tail. He carried Cerberus to the surface world and presented him to Eurystheus, who was so terrified he ordered Heracles to take the dog back immediately. Heracles returned Cerberus to the underworld, and his labors were finally complete. After completing the 12 labors, Heracles was finally free from Eurystheus's service, but his life continued to be filled with adventures and tragedies. He joined Jason and the Argonauts on their quest for the Golden Fleece, though he left the expedition early after his companion Hylas was kidnapped by water nymphs. Heracles married again, this time to Deianira, a princess of Calydon. To win her hand, he had to wrestle the river god Aeschylus, who could change shapes. Even when Achilles transformed into a bull, Heracles overpowered him, breaking off one of his horns. This horn became the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, forever overflowing with food and flowers. Years later, Heracles and Deianira were traveling and came to a river. A centaur named Nessus offered to carry Deianira across. Heracles agreed and crossed the river himself, but midway through, Nessus tried to abduct Deianira. Heracles shot him with an arrow poisoned with hydra blood. As Nessus was dying, he gave Deianira his blood-soaked shirt, telling her it was a love charm. If Heracles ever stopped loving her, she should have him wear this shirt and his love would return. Years passed, and Heracles fell in love with another woman, Iole. Deianira, desperate to win back her husband's affection, remembered Nessus's gift. She sent Heracles the shirt, not knowing it was actually poisoned with hydra blood. When Heracles put it on, the poison began to burn his flesh. He tried to tear it off, but the shirt stuck to his skin, and the poison seared deeper. The pain was unimaginable. Even Heracles, who had endured so much, couldn't bear it. Realizing he was dying, Heracles built a funeral pyre on Mount Aeta. He climbed onto it and begged someone to light it. Finally, the hero Philoctetes agreed to set it ablaze, and in return, Heracles gave him his famous bow and poisoned arrows. As the flames consumed his mortal body, Zeus took his divine part up to Olympus. Hera's hatred finally ended. Recognizing Heracles' suffering and heroism, she reconciled with him, and he married her daughter Hebe, the goddess of youth. Heracles became a god himself, worshipped throughout Greece as a hero who had overcome impossible challenges and transcended his mortality through sheer determination and virtue. Perseus was another son of Zeus, born to Danae, who had been imprisoned in a bronze tower by her father Acrisius, king of Argos. An oracle had told Acrisius that his grandson would kill him, so he locked his daughter away where no man could reach her. But Zeus came to her as a shower of golden rain, and Perseus was conceived. When Acrisius discovered the child, he couldn't bring himself to kill his daughter and grandson directly. That would bring a curse upon him. Instead, he locked them both in a wooden chest and threw it into the sea, letting the gods decide their fate. The chest floated to the island of Seriphos, where a fisherman named Dictys found them and took them in. Perseus grew up strong and brave on the island, but the king of Seriphos, Polydectes, desired Danae and saw Perseus as an obstacle. To get rid of him, Polydectes announced he was gathering gifts to win another woman's hand in marriage and demanded tributes from everyone. Perseus, having nothing to give, rashly promised to bring back anything Polydectes asked for. The king smiled and said he wanted the head of Medusa, the Gorgon, a task that was essentially a death sentence. The Gorgons were three sisters, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa. The first two were immortal, but Medusa was mortal, though equally terrifying. She had once been beautiful, a priestess of Athena, but Poseidon had violated her in Athena's temple. Athena, rather than punishing Poseidon, transformed Medusa into a monster. Her hair became writhing snakes. Her face became so hideous that anyone who looked directly at her turned instantly to stone, and her gaze became deadly. Perseus would have failed if not for the gods. Athena, still angry at Medusa for the desecration of her temple, aided him, as did Hermes. They told him he first needed to visit the Graiae, three ancient sisters who shared a single eye and tooth among them. Perseus stole their eye while they were passing it between them and refused to return it until they told him where to find the Hesperides. From the Hesperides, Perseus obtained three items: winged sandals that let him fly, Hades' helmet of invisibility, and a special bag, kibisus, to safely carry Medusa's head. Hermes gave him an adamantine sword, and Athena gave him a polished bronze shield. Perseus flew to the Gorgons' lair and found them sleeping. Using Athena's shield as a mirror so he didn't have to look at Medusa directly, he approached her carefully. In one swift stroke, he cut off her head. From her severed neck sprang two offspring, Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a giant with a golden sword. Both children Medusa had been carrying since Poseidon had raped her. The other two Gorgons woke and pursued Perseus, but with the helmet of invisibility and the winged sandals, he escaped. On his way home, Perseus flew over Ethiopia and saw a woman chained to a rock by the sea. This was Andromeda, daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia. Cassiopeia had boasted that she, or in some versions, her daughter, was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs. Offended, Poseidon sent a sea monster to ravage the kingdom. And Oracle said the only way to save the kingdom was to sacrifice Andromeda to the monster. Just as the creature emerged from the waves, Perseus swooped down. Some say he turned it to stone with Medusa's head. Others say he fought it with his sword. Either way, he rescued Andromeda, and Cepheus gladly gave Perseus his daughter's hand in marriage. When Perseus returned to Seriphus, he found that Polydectes had been trying to force Danae to marry him, and she and Dictys had taken refuge in a temple. Perseus went to Polydectes' palace, where the king and his supporters were feasting. "You wanted Medusa's head," Perseus said. "Then look at it." He pulled out the Gorgon's head, and Polydectes and all his cronies were turned to stone. Perseus made Dictys king of the island and returned the magical items to the gods. Athena placed Medusa's head on her shield, the Aegis, where it remained as a symbol of her power. Perseus then traveled to Argos with Danae and Andromeda to reconcile with his grandfather. But Acrisius, hearing that Perseus was coming and remembering the prophecy, fled. Perseus followed, not to harm him, but to find him. In the city of Larissa, Perseus participated in some funeral games. During the discus throw, Perseus's throw went astray, whether blown by the wind or simply badly aimed, and struck Acrisius, who had been watching in the crowd. The old king died instantly, and the prophecy was fulfilled. Perseus, grief-stricken at accidentally killing his grandfather, refused to claim the throne of Argos. Instead, he traded kingdoms with the king of Tiryns and founded the city of Mycenae, which would become one of the greatest cities of ancient Greece. Perseus and Andromeda had many children, and through their descendants would come Heracles and many other heroes.
Theseus was the greatest hero of Athens, their answer to Sparta's Heracles. His father was Aegeus, king of Athens, though some whispered he was actually the son of Poseidon. His mother was Aethra, princess of Troezen. Before leaving Troezen, Aegeus placed his sandals and sword under an enormous rock and told Aethra that when their son was strong enough to lift the rock, he should bring these tokens to Athens. When Theseus came of age, he easily lifted the rock and took the tokens. His mother and grandfather urged him to travel to Athens by sea, the safe route, but Theseus wanted to prove himself. He chose the dangerous coastal road, which was infested with bandits and monsters. Along the way, he made it his mission to punish these villains with their own methods, a form of poetic justice. First, he encountered Periphetes, also called the Clubber, who used a bronze club to kill travelers. Theseus wrestled the club away from him and beat him to death with it, then kept the club as his own weapon. Next came Sinus, the pine bender, who would tie travelers between two bent pine trees and then release the trees, tearing his victims apart. Theseus did the same to him. Then there was the Cromonian sow, a monstrous pig that terrorized the region. Theseus hunted and killed it. At the Isthmus of Corinth, he met Scyron, who forced travelers to wash his feet at the edge of a cliff, then kicked them off the cliff to be eaten by a giant sea turtle below. Theseus grabbed Scyron's legs and flipped him over the cliff to his own death. In Eleusis, he faced Cercyon, who forced travelers to wrestle him to the death. No one had ever won. Theseus beat him at his own game and killed him. Finally, near Athens, he encountered Procrustes, the stretcher, who offered hospitality to travelers. But Procrustes had a special bed. If visitors were too short for it, he would stretch them on a rack until they fit. If they were too tall, he would cut off their legs. Theseus put Procrustes in his own bed, and finding him too tall, cut off his head. When Theseus finally arrived in Athens, Aegeus didn't recognize him, but Medea did. Yes, that Medea, the sorceress from Colchis, who helped Jason steal the golden fleece. After Jason's betrayal, she had fled to Athens and married Aegeus, bearing him a son. She saw Theseus as a threat to her son's inheritance and convinced Aegeus that this stranger was dangerous. She prepared a cup of poison for Theseus to drink at a welcome feast.
But as Theseus reached for the cup, he carved his meat with the sword Aegeus had left under the rock. Aegeus recognized the sword, knocked the poison cup from Theseus's hand, and embraced his son. Medea fled Athens in her flying chariot pulled by dragons, and Theseus was declared heir to the throne. At this time, Athens was under a dark obligation. Years earlier, Aegeus's son Androgeus had been killed while visiting Crete, either murdered out of jealousy or killed by the Marathonian bull. King Minos of Crete had attacked Athens in revenge, and after a devastating siege, demanded a terrible tribute. Every 9 years, Athens had to send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete, where they would be fed to the Minotaur. The Minotaur was a monster with the head of a bull and the body of a man, born from an unnatural union. Minos' wife Pasiphae had been cursed by Poseidon to fall in love with a magnificent white bull. The craftsman Daedalus had built her a hollow wooden cow so realistic that the bull was fooled, and Pasiphae was able to satisfy her unnatural desire. The result was the Minotaur, a savage creature that ate human flesh. Minos was so ashamed of this monster that he had Daedalus build an enormous labyrinth beneath his palace, a maze so complex that no one could escape it. The Minotaur was locked inside, and Athens' youths were sent in to die.
When the time came for the third tribute, Theseus volunteered to be one of the victims, vowing to kill the Minotaur and end the tribute forever. Aegeus was terrified of losing his newfound son, but Theseus was determined. They agreed on a signal. Theseus's ship would sail with black sails, but if he survived, he would change them to white sails on the return journey, so Aegeus would know his son lived. When Theseus arrived in Crete, Princess Ariadne, Minos' daughter, saw him and fell instantly in love. She couldn't bear the thought of him dying in the labyrinth, so she went to Daedalus and asked for help. Daedalus gave her a ball of thread. Ariadne gave this to Theseus, along with a sword, and told him to tie one end of the thread at the entrance and unwind it as he went deeper. That way, after killing the Minotaur, he could follow the thread back out. Theseus entered the labyrinth with the other victims. He tied the thread to the entrance and ventured into the darkness, following the sound of the Minotaur's breathing. The passages twisted and turned, going up and down, doubling back on themselves. Finally, in the heart of the labyrinth, he found the Minotaur, a massive creature with the head of a bull, standing upright on 2 legs, its breath reeking of blood and death. The battle was fierce, but Theseus was stronger and cleverer. He wrestled with the beast, dodging its horns, and finally drove his sword into its heart. The Minotaur fell dead, and Theseus gathered the other Athenians. Following the thread, they found their way out of the labyrinth. They met Ariadne, and together they all rushed to the ship and sailed away before Minos could stop them. But tragedy followed. They stopped at the island of Naxos to rest, and here the story becomes unclear. In some versions, Theseus cruelly abandoned Ariadne while she slept, either because he was tired of her or because Athena told him to. In other versions, Dionysus appeared to Theseus in a dream and claimed Ariadne for himself, and Theseus had no choice but to leave her. Either way, Ariadne woke up alone on the beach,
watching Theseus's ship disappear over the horizon. Dionysus found her there, crying, and fell in love with her. He comforted her and made her his wife, taking her to Olympus and making her immortal. He gave her a crown of 7 stars, which he later placed in the sky as the constellation Corona Borealis. Meanwhile, Theseus sailed home to Athens, but he was so distracted, either by grief over Ariadne or simply by celebrating his victory, that he forgot to change the sails from black to white. Aegeus was watching from a cliff every day, waiting for his son's return. When he saw the black sails, he assumed Theseus was dead. In his despair, he threw himself from the cliff into the sea, which was thereafter called the Aegean Sea in his honor. Theseus became king of Athens and proved to be a wise ruler. He unified the scattered towns of Attica under Athens's rule, established laws, and created institutions that made Athens a great city. But his adventures weren't over. He fought the Amazons and married their queen, Antiope, or in some versions her sister, Hippolyta, which later led to the Amazons attacking Athens in revenge. He fought alongside Heracles in several adventures. He befriended Pirithous, king of the Lapiths, and fought beside him when centaurs tried to kidnap Lapith women at Pirithous' wedding, a battle depicted on many Greek temples. But Theseus's later life was marked by tragedy. When Antiope died, he married Phaedra, Ariadne's sister. Theseus had a son from an earlier relationship named Hippolytus, a virtuous young man devoted to Artemis who had sworn to remain chaste. Phaedra fell in love with her stepson, but Hippolytus rejected her advances, horrified by the incestuous proposition. Humiliated and angry, Phaedra accused Hippolytus of trying to rape her and then hanged herself. Theseus believed her lies and cursed his own son, asking Poseidon to kill him. Poseidon sent a sea monster that frightened Hippolytus's horses, causing his chariot to crash. Hippolytus was dragged to his death, his body broken. Artemis revealed the truth to Theseus, but it was too late. His son was dead, killed by his father's curse. Theseus's final adventure was his most foolish. He and Pirithous decided they should both marry daughters of Zeus. Theseus chose Helen, who was only a child at the time, and they kidnapped her from Sparta. Then Pirithous decided he wanted Persephone, queen of the underworld herself. They descended into Hades, but when they asked Hades for Persephone, the god of the dead invited them to sit down. The moment they sat in the chairs of forgetfulness, they became stuck, unable to move, their memories fading. They would have remained there forever, but when Heracles came to capture Cerberus, he found them and managed to free Theseus, though Pirithous had to remain as punishment for his greater sacrilegious. Theseus returned to Athens to find the city had moved on without him. His political enemies had seized power, and he was no longer welcome in the city he had built. He fled to the island of Skyros, where King Lycomedes pretended to offer him hospitality, but secretly feared him. While showing Theseus the view from a high cliff, Lycomedes pushed him off. The greatest hero of Athens died far from home, betrayed and forgotten.
In Iolcus, a city in Thessaly, there lived a king named Aeson, who was overthrown by his half-brother Peleus. To protect his infant son Jason from Peleus's murderous intentions, Aeson sent the boy to be raised by Chiron, the wise centaur who had trained so many heroes. Jason grew up learning the arts of war, music, medicine, and wisdom in Chiron's cave on Mount Pelion. When Jason came of age, he decided to reclaim his father's throne. As he traveled to Iolcus, he came to a river swollen with floodwaters. An old woman stood at the bank, unable to cross. Jason, having been taught to honor the gods and help those in need, offered to carry her across. The river was treacherous and the woman surprisingly heavy, but Jason struggled through the currents. Midway across, he lost one of his sandals in the mud, but he continued and safely deposited the old woman on the far bank. She revealed herself as Hera in disguise. She had been testing him, and from that moment she became his patron and protector. But she warned him that Peleus was his enemy. When Jason arrived in Iolcus wearing only one sandal, Peleus was terrified. An oracle had warned him to beware of a man with one sandal who would be his doom. But Peleus was cunning. He pretended to welcome Jason and agreed to surrender the throne on one condition. Jason must first prove himself worthy by retrieving the golden fleece from Colchis at the edge of the known world. The golden fleece had a legendary history. It came from a flying ram with golden wool that had carried two children, Phrixus and Helle, away from their murderous stepmother. Helle fell off during the flight and drowned in the strait that would be called the Hellespont in her honor. But Phrixus reached Colchis safely and sacrificed the ram to Zeus, giving the fleece to King Aeetes, who hung it in a sacred grove guarded by a sleepless dragon that never closed its eyes. Jason accepted the challenge and sent out a call for heroes to join him. The ship Argus built for the quest was called the Argo, and it was unlike any ship ever made. Its prow contained a piece of oak from Zeus's sacred oracle at Dodona, which could speak prophecy. The heroes who answered Jason's call were called the Argonauts, and they were the greatest warriors and adventurers of their generation. Among them were Hercules, the strongest man alive, Orpheus, whose music could charm even stones, Castor and Polydeuces, the divine twins, Atalanta, the swift huntress, Meleager, slayer of the Caledonian boar, Peleus, who would father Achilles, Telamon, father of Ajax, Zetes and Calais, winged sons of the north wind, Typhus, the master helmsman, Idmon, the seer, Mopsus, the prophet, Argus, the shipwright, and many others. It was the most impressive gathering of heroes Greece had ever seen. Their journey was filled with adventures. They stopped at Lemnos, an island inhabited only by women who had murdered all their men. The Argonauts stayed longer than they should have, fathering children with the Lemnian women, until Hercules urged them to continue their quest. At Cyzicus, they were welcomed by King Cyzicus, but when they left and were blown back by a storm in the night, they were mistaken for pirates. In the darkness, the Argonauts fought their former hosts, and Jason accidentally killed King Cyzicus, a tragedy that haunted him.
In Mysia, Heracles' young companion, Hylas, went to fetch water and was pulled into a spring by water nymphs who fell in love with his beauty. Heracles searched frantically for him, but the Argo had to sail on, leaving the greatest hero behind. They passed through the Symplegades, the clashing rocks that would smash together, crushing any ship that tried to pass. Following the advice of the seer, Phineus, whom they had helped by driving away the harpies that tormented him, they first sent a dove through. The rocks clashed, catching only the dove's tail feathers. Then, as the rocks separated, the Argonauts rowed with all their might. The rocks closed again, catching only the Argo's stern ornament. After their passage, the rocks became fixed and never moved again. Finally, they reached Colchis, a kingdom at the far eastern edge of the Black Sea, ruled by King Aeetes, son of Helios, the sun god. Jason presented himself and explained his quest. Aeetes had no intention of giving up the golden fleece, but he pretended to consider it. He set Jason what seemed like an impossible task. Jason must yoke 2 fire-breathing bronze bulls, plow the field with them, and sow the field with dragon's teeth. From these teeth would spring armed warriors, and Jason would have to defeat them all, and he had to do it all in a single day. Jason would have failed, but Hera and Aphrodite intervened. They caused Aeetes' daughter Medea, a powerful sorceress and priestess of Hecate, to fall madly in love with Jason. Medea was torn between loyalty to her father and her overwhelming passion for this foreign hero. Her love won out. She met Jason secretly and gave him a magical ointment that would protect him from the bronze bull's fire and make him temporarily invincible. She also told him the secret to defeating the warriors. When they sprang from the earth, he should throw a stone among them, and they would fight each other instead of him. The next day, Jason performed the tasks exactly as Medea had instructed. He yoked the fire-breathing bulls, though they snorted flames that would have incinerated any normal man. He plowed the field and sowed the dragon's teeth. When the armed warriors sprouted from the earth, fully grown and hostile, he threw a stone in their midst. Confused, they turned on each other in a bloody melee, and Jason cut down the survivors. Aeetes was furious, but pretended to accept Jason's success, promising to give him the fleece the next day. But Medea knew her father planned treachery. He would kill the Argonauts in the night. She rushed to Jason and told him they had to steal the fleece immediately and flee. Together, they went to the sacred grove where the golden fleece hung on an oak tree, guarded by the sleepless dragon. Medea used her magic and herbs to lull the creature into its first sleep since the beginning of time. Jason grabbed the gleaming fleece, and they ran to the Argo with Medea's young brother, Apsyrtus, who had followed them.
Aeetes discovered the theft and pursued them with his fleet. In the most disturbing part of the story, Medea committed a horrific act to save them. She killed her own brother Absyrtus and cut his body into pieces, scattering them in the sea. Aeetes stopped to gather his son's remains for proper burial, and this delay allowed the Argo to escape. The return journey was long and dangerous, taking a different route through magical waters. They encountered the Sirens, women whose song was so beautiful it lured sailors to their deaths. But Orpheus played his lyre so beautifully that it drowned out their voices. They sailed past Scylla and Charybdis, between a six-headed monster and a whirlpool. They were purified of Absyrtus's murder by Circe, Medea's aunt, and a powerful sorceress herself. They were aided by the Phaeacians when the Colchian fleet caught up with them. Finally, after years of travel, they returned to Iolcus with the Golden Fleece. But Jason's troubles were far from over. Peleus refused to give up the throne, claiming Jason had not returned within the expected time. Medea, using her sorcery, tricked Peleus's own daughters into killing their father. She demonstrated her magic by cutting up an old ram, boiling it with herbs, and producing a young, living lamb. She told Peleus's daughters they could restore their elderly father's youth the same way. They cut up Peleus and boiled him. But of course, Medea didn't provide the magic herbs this time. Peleus died horribly, and Jason and Medea had to flee Iolcus, pursued by Peleus's son Acastus. They found refuge in Corinth, where they lived for several years and had children. But Jason, ambitious and ungrateful, decided to divorce Medea to marry Glauce, the daughter of King Creon of Corinth, which would make him heir to the throne. Medea's love turned to rage. This foreign woman had betrayed her father, murdered her brother, left her homeland, and committed terrible crimes, all for Jason. And now he was casting her aside. Medea's revenge was terrible and perfect. She pretended to accept the divorce gracefully and sent wedding gifts to Glauce, a beautiful dress and a golden crown. But both were poisoned with a substance so toxic that when Glauce put them on, they burned her flesh. When Creon tried to help his daughter, he too was consumed by the poison. Then, in the most horrific act of all, Medea killed her own children by Jason, not in madness, but deliberately, knowing it would hurt Jason more than anything else could. She wanted him to live with that pain forever. As Jason rushed home, Medea appeared above him in a chariot pulled by dragons, sent by her grandfather Helios. She had the bodies of their children with her, and she mocked Jason's grief. She flew away to Athens, where King Aegeus gave her sanctuary. This was before Theseus arrived. Jason was left alone with his grief and guilt. Years later, he returned to the rotting hulk of the Argo, which had been dedicated in a temple. As he sat in its shadow,
Reminiscing about his glory days, the ship's prow fell off and crushed him. It was a pathetic end for a hero whose quest had been so legendary.
In the kingdom of Caledon, King Aeneas made sacrifices to all the gods after a successful harvest, all except Artemis. Whether he forgot her or deliberately slighted her, the result was the same. Artemis, insulted, sent an enormous boar to ravage Caledon. This was no ordinary boar, but a monster as large as a bull, with tusks like ivory swords and bristles like spears. It destroyed crops, killed livestock, and gored anyone who came near it. Aeneas's son Meleager called for heroes from across Greece to hunt the beast. Many famous warriors answered the call, including Theseus, Jason, Peleus, Telamon, and Nestor. Among them was Atalanta, a virgin huntress dedicated to Artemis, who had been raised by bears after her father abandoned her at birth for being a girl. Atalanta was beautiful and swift, and several of the male hunters resented her presence, claiming a hunt was no place for a woman. But Meleager was already falling in love with her, and insisted she had every right to be there. The hunt began, and the boar proved as dangerous as promised. It killed several hunters with its tusks and scattered others. Atalanta drew first blood, shooting an arrow that struck the beast behind its ear. This enraged it further, and finally Meleager drove his spear into its heart, killing it. Meleager wanted to give the hide and tusks to Atalanta as prizes, acknowledging that she had drawn first blood. But his uncles, his mother's brothers, protested, claiming that if Meleager didn't want the prizes, they should go to them as his closest male relatives, not to a woman. The argument grew heated, and in his anger and pride, Meleager killed his uncles. When Meleager's mother, Althea, heard that her son had killed her brothers, she was consumed by grief and rage. She remembered something from the day Meleager was born. The fates had appeared and said that Meleager would live until a certain log in the fire was completely consumed. Althea had immediately snatched the log from the fire and kept it safe all these years. Now, crying and cursing, she threw it back into the flames. As it burned, Meleager felt himself growing weaker. By the time the log was consumed to ashes, Meleager was dead. Althea, realizing what she had done, hung herself in grief. The women of Caledon wept so much for Meleager that Artemis, taking pity on them, transformed them into guinea fowl. Bellerophon was a prince of Corinth who accidentally killed his brother and had to seek purification. He went to King Proetus of Tyrenes, who purified him and welcomed him as a guest. But Proetus's wife, Stenobea, fell in love with Bellerophon. When he rejected her advances, she falsely accused him of trying to seduce her. Proetus believed his wife, but couldn't kill a guest. That would violate the sacred law of hospitality and bring divine punishment. Instead, he sent Bellerophon to his father-in-law, King Iobates of Lycia, with a sealed letter. The letter asked Iobates to kill the bearer. Iobates faced the same dilemma.
Bellerophon was now his guest, so he devised a solution. He would send Bellerophon on an impossible mission that would kill him without Iobates directly breaking the laws of hospitality. He ordered Bellerophon to kill the Chimera, a monster that terrorized Lycia. The Chimera was horrifying. It had the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and the tail of a serpent, and it breathed fire from multiple mouths. It had killed countless warriors who had tried to face it. But the gods favored Bellerophon. Athena came to him in a dream and told him where he could find Pegasus, the winged horse that had sprung from Medusa's blood when Perseus killed her. She gave him a golden bridle that would allow him to tame the divine horse. Bellerophon found Pegasus drinking at a spring and was able to approach and bridle him. The two formed an immediate bond. Riding Pegasus, Bellerophon could attack the Chimera from above, staying out of range of its fire and claws. He attached a lump of lead to the end of his spear and drove it into the monster's throat. The Chimera's fiery breath melted the lead, which poured down into its stomach and killed it from within. Bellerophon returned victorious, but Iobates wasn't finished trying to kill him. He sent Bellerophon against the warlike Solymi tribe. Bellerophon won them. He sent him against the Amazons. He defeated them too, flying above them on Pegasus. Finally, Iobates sent his own palace guard to ambush Bellerophon, but the hero killed them all. Iobates realized the gods must favor Bellerophon, so he showed him the letter and explained everything. The king made peace with him, gave him his daughter in marriage, and made him heir to the throne. For a while, Bellerophon was happy and honored, but pride was his downfall. Bellerophon began to believe he was equal to the gods. He mounted Pegasus and tried to fly up to Mount Olympus itself to take his place among the immortals. Zeus, offended by this hubris, sent a gadfly to sting Pegasus. The horse bucked, and Bellerophon fell all the way back to earth. He survived the fall, but was crippled and blinded. Pegasus continued to Olympus, where Zeus used him to carry his thunderbolts. Bellerophon spent the rest of his life wandering alone, shunned by men and gods alike, a living example of what happens when mortals forget their place.
Orpheus was the son of the muse Calliope and the Thracian king Oeagrus, or in some versions, Apollo himself. From his mother, he inherited a divine gift for music, and Apollo gave him a lyre. When Orpheus played and sang, animals would gather to listen. Trees would bend closer. Rivers would pause in their courses, and even stones would be moved to tears. His music could charm anything in creation. Orpheus fell deeply in love with a beautiful wood nymph named Eurydice, and she loved him just as much. They married, and for a brief time they were perfectly happy. But on their wedding day, while Eurydice was walking through a meadow with her fellow nymphs, a shepherd named Aristeos saw her and was overcome with lust. He chased her, and as Eurydice fled, she stepped on a venomous snake hidden in the grass. It bit her ankle, and the poison was so potent that she died almost instantly. Her shade descended to the underworld, and Orpheus was left devastated.
Unlike other mortals who accepted the finality of death, Orpheus could not. His grief was so profound that his music became unbearably sad. When he played, the world itself seemed to mourn. Finally, he made a decision that no living mortal had attempted. He would descend into the underworld and bring Eurydice back to life. He found an entrance to Hades and descended with only his lyre. The shades of the dead gathered around him, drawn by his music. When he reached the river Styx, Charon, the ferryman, was so moved by Orpheus's song that he carried him across without payment. Cerberus, the three-headed guard dog, let him pass, lulled by the sweet melodies. Orpheus walked through the underworld, and wherever he went, his music brought a strange spell. In Tartarus, the tortures paused. Ixion's wheel stopped spinning. Tantalus forgot his hunger and thirst. Sisyphus sat down on his boulder, and even the Furies wept. Finally, Orpheus came before Hades and Persephone on their dark thrones. He played for them and sang of his love for Eurydice, of the cruelty of her death, of his unbearable grief. His music was so beautiful and his love so genuine that Persephone wept, and even Hades, grim, inflexible Hades, who had never been moved by any plea, was touched. The Lord of the Dead agreed to let Eurydice return to life, but he set one condition. Orpheus must walk out of the underworld, and Eurydice would follow him. But he must not look back at her until they both reached the surface and felt the sunlight. If he looked back even once, she would be lost forever. Orpheus agreed and began the long climb back up to the world of the living. Behind him, he could hear the soft footsteps of Eurydice following him. But as he walked, doubts began to creep in. Was she really there? What if Hades had tricked him? What if she wasn't following after all? The path was long and dark, and he heard no voice, no breathing, just those soft footsteps. His anxiety grew with every step. Finally, they reached the tunnel's end. Orpheus could see daylight ahead, and he stepped out into the sunshine. Relieved, forgetting himself in his joy, he turned around to embrace Eurydice, but she had not yet crossed the threshold. She was still in the shadows of the cave. For one brief moment, they saw each other. Eurydice reached out to him, but she was already fading. "Farewell," she whispered, and she was pulled back down into the darkness. This time, it was forever. Orpheus tried to follow her back down, but now Charon refused to ferry him. He sat by the entrance to the underworld for 7 days without eating or drinking, but the gods would not allow him to die yet. Finally, he returned to the world, but he was a broken man. He never touched another woman, remaining faithful to Eurydice's memory. Some say he even invented homosexual love, or at least introduced it to Thrace. Years later, Orpheus was torn apart by Maenads, female followers of Dionysus, who were in a religious frenzy. Some say they were jealous because he refused them. Others say Dionysus was angry because Orpheus worshipped Apollo,
above all other gods. The Maenads ripped him limb from limb and threw his head into the river Hebrus. As it floated downstream to the sea, the head was still singing. His lyre was placed in the sky as a constellation, and his soul finally descended to the underworld, where he was reunited with Eurydice at last.
The city of Thebes was founded by Cadmus, who had come searching for his sister Europa after Zeus abducted her. Cadmus killed a dragon sacred to Ares, and, following Athena's instruction, sowed its teeth in the ground. Armed warriors sprang up, and Cadmus threw a stone among them, causing them to fight each other until only 5 survived. These 5 became the ancestors of Thebes' noble families. But because Cadmus had killed Ares's dragon, a curse hung over the city and his bloodline. Generations later, King Laius of Thebes married Jocasta. An oracle warned him that any son he fathered would kill him and marry Jocasta, his own mother. Terrified, Laius avoided his wife's bed. But one night he drank too much wine and slept with her, and Jocasta became pregnant. When the baby was born, Laius was determined to thwart the prophecy. He drove a pin through the infant's ankles, giving him the name Oedipus, meaning swollen foot, and gave him to a shepherd, ordering the man to leave the baby on Mount Citharon to die. But the shepherd took pity on the infant, and instead gave him to a shepherd from Corinth. This shepherd brought the baby to King Polybus and Queen Merope of Corinth, who were childless. They adopted him and raised him as their own son, never telling him he was not their biological child. Oedipus grew up believing he was a prince of Corinth, but one day a drunk man at a banquet mocked him, saying he was not his father's son. Troubled, Oedipus went to the oracle at Delphi to ask about his parentage. The oracle didn't answer his question, but instead gave him a horrifying prophecy. He would kill his father and marry his mother. Determined to avoid this fate, Oedipus decided never to return to Corinth, where he believed his parents lived. Instead, he set out to Thebes. On the road, at a place where 3 ways met, he encountered a chariot carrying an old man and his servants. The narrow road had room for only one party to pass, and the old man's herald ordered Oedipus to step aside. When Oedipus refused, the herald struck him, and the old man hit him on the head with his staff as the chariot passed. Oedipus's temper flared. He had inherited the violence of his line. He struck back, killing the old man and most of his servants. Only one escaped. Oedipus continued to Thebes, having no idea he had just fulfilled the first part of the prophecy. The old man was Laius, his biological father. When Oedipus reached Thebes, he found the city in crisis. A monster called the Sphinx had taken residence outside the gates. She had the head of a woman, the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the tail of a serpent. She posed a riddle to every traveler, and those who couldn't answer were devoured. The riddle was, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? No one had been able to answer, and the city was slowly being strangled. King Laius had left to consult an oracle about the Sphinx, and news had just arrived that he'd been killed by bandits on the road. Creon, Jocasta's brother, was serving as regent, and promised that whoever could defeat the Sphinx would marry the widowed queen and become king of Thebes. Oedipus approached the Sphinx and heard her riddle. He thought carefully and answered, "Man. As an infant, he crawls on 4 legs. As an adult, he walks on 2 legs. In old age, he walks with a cane, 3 legs." The Sphinx, in rage and shame at being defeated, threw herself from her cliff and died. Oedipus was hailed as a hero and savior. True to his word, Creon gave Oedipus the throne and arranged his marriage to Jocasta. Oedipus had now fulfilled the second part of the prophecy without knowing it. He had married his own mother. They lived together for many years and had 4 children, 2 sons, Eteocles and Polynices, and 2 daughters, Antigone and Ismene. Oedipus ruled wisely, and Thebes prospered. But the gods do not forget. Years later, a terrible plague descended upon Thebes. Crops failed, animals died, women miscarried, and disease ravaged the population. Oedipus sent Creon to Delphi to ask the oracle how to end the plague. The answer came back. The murderer of Laius still lived in Thebes, and until he was found and punished, the pollution would continue. Oedipus, not knowing he himself was the murderer, swore to find the killer, and declared that whoever it was would be exiled from Thebes forever. He sent for Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes, to help identify the murderer. But when Tiresias arrived, he was reluctant to speak. Oedipus pressed him, and finally the prophet said, "You are the murderer you seek." Oedipus was furious, thinking this was a political plot by Creon to seize the throne. But then details began to emerge. A messenger arrived from Corinth with news that King Polybus had died, and the people wanted Oedipus to return as king. Jocasta said this proved prophecies were worthless. Oedipus's father had died of natural causes, not by Oedipus's hand. But Oedipus was still worried about the second part of the prophecy, about marrying his mother. The messenger, trying to comfort him, revealed that Polybus and Merope were not his real parents. The messenger himself had received baby Oedipus from a Theban shepherd years ago. Jocasta suddenly understood the horrible truth. She rushed into the palace and hanged herself in her bedroom. When Oedipus found her body, he took the golden pins from her dress and stabbed them into his own eyes, blinding himself. He couldn't bear to see the world anymore, not after what he had done. He had killed his father and married his mother, exactly as the oracle had predicted, despite all his efforts to avoid his fate. Oedipus was driven out of Thebes, just as he himself had decreed. His daughter, Antigone, went with him as his guide, leading his blind father as he wandered from place to place, begging for food and shelter. His sons, Eteocles and Polynices, did nothing to help him. They were too busy fighting over who would rule Thebes. Eventually, Oedipus reached Colonus, near Athens, where a sacred grove provided him sanctuary. There, after years of suffering, he finally died and was buried in a secret place. Some said the gods took him directly, that the earth opened and swallowed him, granting him a strange kind of peace at the end. His tomb would become a blessing for Athens, protecting it from invasion. The curse of Thebes, however, was far from over. It would continue through his children in the next generation.